This week on the Communicators, an analysis of congressional hearings this week on the proposed merger of Comcast and NBC Universal. Our guests are Joelle Tessler of the Associated Press and Amy Schatz of the Wall Street Journal.
Well, this week in the House and Senate, the NBC-Comcast merger proposal was the focus of two hearings, one in the House and one in the Senate. And that's our focus this week on the Communicators. Joining us to analyze what happened this week is Amy Schatz of the Wall Street Journal and Joelle Tessler of the Associated Press. Joelle Tessler, what is the headline from this week's hearings on the NBC-Comcast proposed merger?
Well, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is that this deal doesn't have to be approved by Congress, it has to be approved by the Justice Department and the FCC. So it's really just an indirect influence that Congress can have. But I think it's likely to be approved, but probably with conditions. And the Democrats really raised a number of issues that could be addressed through conditions attached to any type of approval.
Such as what issues?
Well, one of the biggest ones is what will happen to programming that Comcast will acquire through this combination, because right now Comcast owns some cable channels, but it really is primarily a distribution company, whereas NBC is a media company, and they own a lot of must-have programming, obviously the NBC network and sports programming, and the concern is that Comcast will put a stranglehold on that programming and basically put competitors at a disadvantage, satellite companies, phone companies that are providing video services, and so they want to ensure that competitors can get access to that programming on fair rates, at fair rates and on fair terms, and that's likely to be at least one of the key issues that gets addressed through a condition.
Amy Schatz, did this break down the hearing along congressional or partisan lines?
Basically, I think mostly you saw Democrats were raising conditions. Democrats mostly were at the hearing. A few Republicans showed up, but there weren't that many there. Basically, Democrats were talking. I thought one of the most interesting things about both the hearings, both the House hearing in the morning and the Senate hearing in the Senate Judiciary Antitrust Committee in the afternoon, was that none of the lawmakers actually said they thought the deal should not be approved. Mostly they were just talking about what kind of conditions should you impose on this deal so that consumers aren't harmed, or competitors aren't harmed, or that the combined Comcast and NBC would have too much market power. And so I thought that was like a really interesting thing because, you know, as Joelle said, Congress doesn't have to approve this deal, but if Congress was really upset about this deal, they could put a lot of pressure on the FCC and the Justice Department to do a little bit more, or to try to stall this or kill it altogether. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting part. But yeah, it did basically break down along party lines. Republicans were saying there's not that many competitive issues because Comcast and NBC don't really compete in each other's markets. Democrats were saying, wow, this could really lead to higher prices for consumers, and this could really, really hurt Comcast competitors as they're trying to get programming or retrans fees from Comcast.
Well, two of the lawmakers who did show up, Energy and Commerce Chairman Henry Waxman and the ranking member of the Telecommunications Subcommittee, Cliff Stearns, a Republican of Florida, had an exchange regarding the proposed merger. Here it is.
Comcast, as all of us know, is the nation's largest video programming distributor, and NBC is the nation's fourth largest media and entertainment company. Nevertheless, there is, in my opinion, little to suggest that a Comcast-NBCU combination would seriously threaten competition in the media entertainment industries. We all know this is a highly competitive segment of the economy, and ultimately consumers stand to benefit. Since NBCU and Comcast do not compete in most segments of the market, this deal will not bring about consolidation, so to speak. Comcast has interest in only 5 wholly owned and 6 partially owned national cable networks. So together, these networks only represent about 3% of national cable network advertising and affiliate revenue.
When the proposed combination of Comcast and NBC was announced last year, I said that this transaction had the potential to shape and reshape the media marketplace and raise fundamental questions regarding diversity, competition, and the future of the production and distribution of video content. I urge the FCC and the Department of Justice to assess rigorously whether this transaction is in the public interest. Well, 2 months have passed since this transaction was announced, and after additional review, I'm now even more certain that this new joint venture, if approved, could trigger dramatic changes in the way consumers access video programming, in the way independent programmers distribute their works, and also in the way all video distributors compete for customers.
Joelle Tessler, what did you hear in that exchange?
Well, I think Cliff Stearns actually got to the heart of one of the biggest issues that is going to be a focus of the review, which is essentially, is this what kind of a combination is this, and what type of antitrust issues does it raise? And what Cliff Stearns the point that he was making is that these companies operate in different businesses. They don't overlap. Comcast is primarily a distribution company. They provide cable services. They provide broadband connections to the internet, whereas NBC is a media company. And so essentially they are in different businesses, and that's why a lot of the Republicans really feel that this doesn't raise traditional antitrust concerns and the deal should go forward without conditions, I think some of them believe. But the concern is really that what you have here is a vertical integration. You have the company that already owns the pipes that go into people's homes that deliver content will now own the content itself. And so that raises a different set of issues. It's not a matter of two companies reducing the amount of competition in one market. It's about Comcast, whether they will use their hold over the must-have programming that NBC will bring it to put competitors at a disadvantage. And it raises a number of issues. I mean, one, the program access questions that we talked about earlier, but it also gets into questions about, will Comcast allow more independent networks on its own cable system, since it will have so much of its own programming that competes with those networks from the NBC acquisition. And that's really one of the issues that's going to be at the heart of the review at the FCC and DOJ especially.
I think one of the other interesting issues that Chairman Waxman brought up during the hearing was really the issue about online video and what kind of power, market power, is Comcast going to have moving forward. Because as Joelle said, Comcast really is right now a distribution company, and they distribute cable to your house, but they also distribute internet. And they're one of the nation's largest internet providers. And so when you're combining internet lines like that and also content with NBC's content and partial ownership of Hulu, which is one of the major online video places where people go to watch TV shows now for free. When you combine all that together, that adds a whole different issue. And that was one of the major focuses of both of the hearings. And Henry Waxman brought it up, and some of the other members did too, where they were asking about, what kind of market power is Comcast going to have on the online video field, and how is that going to impact local station owners, and how is that going to impact other cable providers in the future?
Well, another piece of video we have from the Thursday hearing was the House Subcommittee Chair Rick Boucher, a Democrat of Virginia, and he talked to both Jeff Zucker of NBC and Brian Roberts of Comcast about online programming, and here's what he had to say.
What about Boxy? Mr. Zucker, you probably are in a better position to answer that. Did Hulu block the Boxy users from access to the Hulu programs?
Well, this was a decision made by the Hulu management what Boxy was doing was illegally taking the content that was on Hulu without any business deal. And, we have several distributors, actually many distributors of the Hulu content that we have legal distribution deals with. So we don't preclude distribution deals. What we preclude are those who illegally take that content.
Well, would you have negotiations with Boxy upon request?
We have always said that we're open to negotiations.
All right. One further question, and my time has expired. Can the two of you offer to us assurance that the programs that are delivered over the air by NBC today and are then available on the NBC.com website for online viewing will not migrate into the TV Everywhere format so that they then would be available only to people who have a cable subscription? Can you give us that assurance?
Yes.
Yeah, the Boxy exchange was really fun because just a few hours after that exchange, Boxy actually came out with a statement and said, wow, we don't know where Jeff Zucker came up with that, because they said basically, look, we're not illegally taking Hulu and having it over our devices. And for people who don't use Boxy, basically it's a program that you can have on your PC, and it allows you, if you put some cables in your laptop and you pop them into your digital TV, you can watch streaming video that you would normally watch on your PC, you can watch it on your TV. And Hulu had been blocked off Boxee for a while, and after that exchange, Boxee came out with a statement saying, wow, we would love to talk to Hulu about this, and we would love to not have this problem, but, and it's right that Hulu's management had some problems with Boxee, but Hulu's management at the time said it was because of NBC. And so they basically said in their statement, wow, you know, we'd love to talk to Jeff Zucker about getting some licensing deal for this, but, you know, if he says he's going to do it now, okay, we'll try. But it was a really interesting exchange, and it's one that's going to keep coming up because this is an issue. It's really where people are starting to watch more TV now. And, you know, they can watch C-SPAN online, if they can watch other things online. And it's really, that's where the future is, and that's where a lot of the affiliates are worried about, you know, as you're moving forward and if more people are going to watch video online, the people who control that video and control that content, how are they going to use their market power to prevent other companies from getting it?
Joelle Tessler, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it raises, well, one thing to add on the Boxee exchange, which Amy was talking about, is that I believe that there's some difference of opinion about exactly who made the decision to block Hulu content from Boxee, because essentially I believe that was NBC that pressured the management of Hulu to do that, and then meanwhile, at the hearing yesterday, Jeff Zucker said, oh, that was a decision made by Hulu's management. But going back to the broader point, what this really gets at is that the internet is, people, as Amy said, more and more people are watching video on the internet, and the question for a company like Comcast in particular, as the nation's largest cable company, is do they see the internet as a threat to their core cable business? And you know, it's really unclear. They say that they don't. They say that they actually think that the internet is a good thing and it will expand their business, and they want to allow people to watch programming in any form and in any type of device that they want, and they'll deliver it to them, as they say, wherever they want it. But it is a significant threat, and the question is, are they going to move programming that right now is available for free, both over-the-air programming from NBC and also programming that's available online? Will they move it behind a paid wall on the internet? Will you be able to get access to programming for free online, or will you have to pay for it similar to the way you pay for subscription television service like cable?
Joelle Tessler, both you and Amy Schatz have mentioned that Congress really doesn't have a role in saying yay or nay to this joint venture or merger. But do you see Congress and individual members working to get concessions from NBC and or Comcast to, you know, sign off on this deal?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, and Amy can jump in here, but I would imagine that I'm sure that they will weigh in with the companies, but I would imagine that the pressure actually is going to fall more on the FCC and DOJ. They're likely to try to influence the analysis that goes on at the agencies that are actually doing the review of the process, and that's how they could influence the outcome of the reviews and what types of conditions get attached.
Yeah, that gets really dicey because a lot of members of Congress also accept campaign contributions from these companies. And so if you're a member, you can't actually say, wow, I really think this deal should be approved, FCC. You should really go do that right now. That gets really, really, that can look pretty bad, actually, if you've gotten a huge campaign contribution from Comcast or NBC in the past. You know, often what they'll do is say, well, these are a lot of issues that we think the agency should look at, and we think this is a concern. Wow, the agency should look at that. And they will send a letter or have a hearing or something and talk to the agency about that and try to pressure them that way. It's slightly different, but they can actually say, wow, you've got to go approve this right now because this is really important for the American people. That would just not look very good.
Well, two more members talked about who has authority to yay or nay this deal. John Shimkus, a Republican of Arizona, and Anna Eshoo, a Democrat of California.
There are many different issues that we'll be dealing with today, and I just want to make it pretty clear. I do not want the Department of Justice enacting legislative policy. That's our job, and I would be careful for members to another way giving up our responsibilities on telecom policy by enacting processes and procedures and using this and the Department of Justice to do that. So that's kind of where I stand. A profitable NBC Universal is good for all of our constituents, and I hope that this venture between Comcast and NBC will facilitate the creation of more popular programming choices for all Americans. One of the great exports our country has is our media. American films and television shows are one of the ways we reach cultures throughout the world. And I also not sure that's always a good reach of culture, and I do question some of the things our consumers like to watch and what we do sell abroad, and I think it does sometimes not put the best focus on us as a culture.
Telecommunications mega mergers, as well as those in other industry sectors, have the potential to create monopolistic titans. The Department of Justice will ensure that this merger doesn't violate our antitrust laws. But the FCC has a special burden. It must also ensure that this merger protects the public interest. The Comcast-NBC Universal merger is not just about the purchase and sale of private businesses. It involves the transfer of public property, broadcast licenses to operate on America's spectrum. Just as importantly, if left unchecked, this merger has the potential to place a chokehold on the transfer of information on the Internet to consumers today and well into the future. If anything, this proposed merger, I think, demonstrates why we need net neutrality across the board.
Yeah, both of those, I can't exactly remember Shimkus, I think he was actually talking about net neutrality too, when he was bringing up his concerns about the Department of Justice and the FCC basically making policy through mergers. And that's something that Republicans complain about a lot, and they actually complained about when Kevin Martin was the Republican chairman and the FCC was still in charge, because the FCC likes to basically create policy in merger conditions, because they can do a lot with merger conditions. You can get companies to agree to an awful lot. And that's something that we're seeing here with the net neutrality debate, which is something that Comcast is just knee-deep in because they've got a pending lawsuit against the agency about this, and Democrats would really like to see some kind of net neutrality condition put on this merger. Republicans don't want to see that at all, and Comcast doesn't want to see that, and Comcast, along with the Republicans, are arguing that it doesn't make a lot of sense to impose some kind of net neutrality condition only on Comcast as a merger condition, because it wouldn't apply to AT&T, Verizon, or any other of Comcast competitors. And so, yeah, that's one of those things that we're going to see as we go along what Justice and the FCC does. But there's certainly going to be pressure on the Hill, both sides, to get some kind of net neutrality condition put on this thing.
Joelle Tessler.
Yeah, it's interesting because Comcast is in the middle of this unrelated fight with the FCC over net neutrality, which is playing out in the courts here in Washington, and that stems from an action taken under the previous FCC chairman, Kevin Martin. He essentially ordered Comcast to stop blocking traffic, online peer-to-peer file-sharing traffic, a service called BitTorrent, and in that case, Comcast said that it was blocking BitTorrent traffic because it was very bandwidth-intensive traffic. It was eating up all the network bandwidth and was slowing down the network for everybody else. But a lot of people feel that they were slowing down or blocking BitTorrent traffic because they saw online file sharing as a way to trade video on the internet, and that Comcast in turn saw that as a threat to its core business. So you've got that playing out because Comcast essentially challenged that order in court, and at oral arguments a few weeks ago here in Washington, the judges essentially really cast doubt on the FCC's authority to mandate net neutrality rules. And so that's sort of the backdrop to what's happening now, because this concern becomes even bigger when you talk about it in the context of the Comcast-NBC merger, because now you're talking about allowing Comcast, which owns the pipes, to own the content as well through NBC, and the concern is that what they could do, which would really violate the concept of net neutrality, is to favor their own content, put competing content at a disadvantage, try to block content that competes with their core business, that being video delivered over television. So that whole dynamic is playing out in the background here, and Comcast said repeatedly that they don't want net neutrality to be decided as part of this, as a condition to this merger. That has to be addressed separately in the court case and also at a proceeding at the FCC to adopt net neutrality rules, which is going on as well.
Amy Schatz, where do we stand as far as this? First of all, is it a merger, a joint venture? What should we call it officially?
It's a joint venture. It's not necessarily a merger because they're talking about creating basically a different kind of company that will be controlled by Comcast, because basically Comcast is buying 51% of NBC, and GE is going to have the other 49%, at least for a few years. And so we're calling it a joint venture. Some people call it a merger. It's one half dozen of another, I think.
So where do we stand? Comcast has submitted paperwork to the FCC, correct? Did they submit an application? What did they submit?
So so they submitted actually their application to the Department of Justice a couple weeks ago or last week, and they also recently submitted a 145-page document to the FCC where they talked basically about why this was in the interest of the public and why they're going to do all these really awesome things for consumers and how this doesn't have any competitive concerns. And they did basically 145 pages of why this is a really good deal. And then they still have to file, and I think they may have just filed actually formal paperwork to transfer the licenses. Because really what the FCC has to do here is to agree to transfer the licenses from the control of GE to Comcast.
Which is just building on the stuff Amy's talking about, which is that essentially the review at the Justice Department is likely to be really focused on antitrust issues. And again, that kind of goes back to the point of, this is a vertical merger rather than a horizontal merger, so what types of antitrust issues does it actually bring up, since we're not talking about eliminating a competitor or two companies in the same industry merging. So whereas the FCC review is probably going to be broader. They have to look, because they have authority over the broadcast licenses, they will look at things like, is this deal in the public interest? And they look at things like, will it promote more local programming? What about diversity in programming? That review won't focus only on the antitrust issues. It'll be broader and look at also, does this deal promote the public interest?
Well, one of the testifiers at the House hearing yesterday was Connie Abdullah with WOW, a local internet cable provider. And here's an exchange she had with Cliff Stearns and Brian Roberts.
Given that Comcast would not be gaining any new cable properties to compete with your company, what advantage would this company gain from withholding content from you or your customers?
What advantage? Well,
yeah. Why would they want to do it?
I can't offer the same content. If I don't have access to the content, where does my customer go? To my competitor, to Comcast.
Mr. Roberts, you might want to comment on either her comment or Dr. Cooper's.
Well, I go back to the principle here. First of all, the content's going to be made available to our competitors, is available today. In the last 2 years, Comcast has lost nationally over about 1.5 million customers, while phone and satellite and the wide open wests of the country have added over 7 million. In fact, the second and third largest distributors of multi-channel video in the country today are two satellite companies. So there is a very competitive market. One of the reasons we want to get more invested in content is we see the value of that content growing. And I think the premise of the way you phrased the question I agree with, which is we will be well served to make that content available to all the growing players in the marketplace. So I think this will ultimately lead to more innovation, more content creation. We see it as a growing business. I'm sure somewhere we'll talk about the intellectual property and how to protect it. We are very much focused on that same issue. And I think we recognize that this is a very competitive video distribution marketplace, and this is an opportunity to participate in the growing part. And as the Internet grows, as the Chairman asked, we want to see the content available and growing for the consumer, because that's where the consumer wants to be.
May I respond
Sure.
to that? Just clarify
Very quickly, Ms. Abdullah.
Pardon me?
Very quickly, please.
It's not just about withholding content. It's also about putting restrictions and conditions on how we offer that content. Those are two things that we need to consider here, because that happens as well.
Joelle Tessler, is that one of the antitrust issues that DOJ will be looking at?
That's one of the biggest issues that's going to come up in these reviews, which is what happens when you allow Comcast, which competes with satellite companies, it competes with smaller cable companies, it competes with Verizon and AT&T, which have rolled out their own video services in recent years. When you give Comcast control of this must-have programming, the NBC network, sports programming, because as the executive from Wide Open West said, how is she going to compete if she doesn't have access to this programming? Her customers will go to the competitor, and that really goes to the point of, well, no, it's not a horizontal merger because NBC and Comcast are in different businesses, and the Comcast executives keep making that point over and over, and he said it there in the testimony, but the point is that it raises a different set of antitrust concerns, and the regulators reviewing this deal are going to have to really address that to make sure that competitors can still get access to the programming they need. And one thing I would add on this is that there are rules in place that were put in place by the 1992 Cable Act, and they're enforced by the FCC, that require cable companies to give competitors, competing video services, access to the programming that they own, essentially to treat them the same way as they treat their own network in negotiations in terms of how much money they pay for access and the rates and the terms of carriage. And Comcast has said repeatedly those rules are in place and we will abide by them, and so there's existing protections that there's no need for our competitors to be so concerned about this. But at the same time, those rules are being challenged in court, and Comcast is actually one of the companies that has brought that challenge. Cablevision is, I believe, leading it. And there's also a lot of concern among the competing video providers that those rules aren't that meaningful anyway. What they want to see is binding arbitration. They feel that the FCC hasn't been real aggressive in enforcing the rules to ensure they can really truly get access to content on fair and non-discriminatory terms.
I think one of the things the WOW executive was really talking about too, she was worried about, after this thing, will she still be able to get Bravo? Will she still be able to get the Golf Channel? Or will she still be able to get, E! Entertainment or channels that her customers are really going to want? And if she doesn't have those channels, they're not going to subscribe to her service. They're going to subscribe to Comcast or Dish or whoever. But she was really worried. So she was worried about that side, which is what Joelle was talking about. But she was also talking about it in the hearings in context of the internet too. And if she was going to provide an internet video service for her customers, then she needs to get access to the video, the online video streams of those channels too. And right now, I'm not sure the FCC rules really apply to the internet, the internet flows of those channels. And so that was another issue that they were talking about in both of the hearings. That's probably going to come up on the FCC side at least.
Well, two final topics to talk about before we close up here. And Amy Schatz, we'll start with you. There was also a Senate hearing on Thursday of this week on this issue. Mr. Zucker, Mr. Roberts testified there also. Anything in that came out of that hearing that was different than the House hearing?
Right. Well, I think the main takeaway was that you don't want to mess with Al Franken because he was incredibly upset with NBC. He's a former NBC employee. He was on Saturday Night Live for, I think, well in 20 years as a writer or a performer, and he really put the whammy on both Brian Roberts and Jeff Zucker during that hearing, mostly over the issues that Joelle was talking about, program access, also program carriage, which is a different thing where these things get really technical, and he got into a sort of an argument with Brian Roberts during the hearing about some of those issues. Which it was fun to watch, but I think the bottom line here is that one of the things that Comcast is running up against here across the board is that as part of anything that they've said that they're going to do in this deal, they say, well, we're going to abide by the law. You should trust us that this is in the public's best interest. The problem they're running into is that a lot of people don't trust them.
And Joelle Tessler, was it significant that the Senate hearing was held by the Judiciary Antitrust Subcommittee while the House hearing was held by the Telecommunications Subcommittee?
Well, I have a feeling that before this whole thing is over, we're going to get the Senate Commerce Committee and House Judiciary Committees weighing in too. I don't think, basically the two committees in both chambers that really have jurisdiction and are going to be paying attention to this are going to be Commerce and Judiciary. So I think they just scheduled these two back to back since the executives are in town. I could be wrong, maybe Amy knows better, but I have a feeling they're going to be, the other two committees are going to be holding hearings as well.
I think they are planning on scheduling them, they just haven't got the dates yet.
So what is next to both of you? What is the next step in this process?
Those hearings, I'd say, would be the next step. I mean, it's going to be a long review. Comcast has said this is going to take 9 months to a year. I mean, they just filed their paperwork, the Hart-Scott-Rodino paperwork with the DOJ and the public interest statement with the FCC last week. So I think that what was going on here this week on Capitol Hill is lawmakers wanted to kind of get ahead of this and really try to influence what issues the regulators take a look at as they examine the deal. They want to shape the debate. I mean, that's the influence that Congress has here. They're not going to be the ones making the decision, but they can influence the discussion. And so the hearings are going to be critical. You'll probably see some letters coming out of these committees going to DOJ and FCC, urging them to look at one issue or another. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is going to be a long process. It's going to probably be up to a year before this is really over.
I think on the DOJ side, we won't find out really much of anything that they're going to do because they keep these things really, really tight to the vest. But from the FCC side, really the next big thing, and as Joelle said, it's going to be months away, is when the FCC chairman/staff decide, to put forth an item to the rest of the commissioners where they say whether they think this thing should be approved or not approved. And that's probably going to be months away. And that really starts the final round of debates on what the conditions are going to look like on this thing.
Amy Schatz of the Wall Street Journal and Joelle Tessler of the Associated Press, thank you both for being on the Communicators. I would simply mention that both the House hearing and the Senate hearing are available to watch in their entirety at cspan.org.
Thank you.
And our coverage of the National Tea Party Convention continues tonight with Sarah Palin's keynote address. That's live at 9 p.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Radio, and online at cspan.org.
Tomorrow on Washington Journal, roll call staff writer David Drucker and Reed Wilson, editor of the Hotline on Call, talk about this week's major congressional and political developments, including the jobless figures, job creation proposals, and the outlook for health care legislation. Then editorial page editors Andrew Klein of the New Hampshire Union Leader and Mike